Welcome, everybody, to the Art of Implementing Well. I'm excited to have my guest today, Matthew Ferguson, who is the Assistant Superintendent and the Chief Academic Officer at the South Carolina Department of Ed. He has a great deal of knowledge around implementing science of reading at scale. And, through our initial conversations, I just thought that getting his perspective on how to do some of this stuff at a state level would be really helpful, as many of your districts are relying on states to provide you with supports and such. So thank you, Matthew, for joining me today. Excited to have you.
Thank you for having me, Anthony. I'm looking forward to the conversation about this really important work and how we move outcomes for students.
So Matthew, why don't maybe just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are, just so this audience gets a sense of who you are first.
Sure. So Anthony, I am a lifelong teacher and educator. Started out as a high school English teacher, assistant principal. At the high school level, got really interested in literacy because so many of my students were coming to high school ill-prepared and unable to read. And as a high school English teacher, I was ill-prepared to teach them how to read. So went back and got a master's in literacy, got interested in administration, was an assistant principal, district office, ELA, social studies coordinator, director of HR, and then for the last several years, I've been working on state accountability models for schools in South Carolina, and recently transitioned to the Department of Education as our deputy superintendent.
Wow, that's quite the resume there. And I also know that you got your Fulbright and spent a lot of time in Bali, and you got the mass back there.
Yes, right after college, I was lucky enough to be awarded a Fulbright to Indonesia. I won the lottery, and that Bali was my placement. I tell people, though, that it was a world away in many different ways. I was first generation college from rural South Carolina, so my very first time on a plane was my 28-hour flight to Indonesia. So
no way.
I was a world away, but that experience also taught me that there are some universals, such as education being a way out and a path forward for so many kids. So whether you're in rural South Carolina or Indonesia, that truth holds universal.
That's pretty cool. So how did the state really start thinking about science reading, and what was kind of the early thinking around why there needed to be a shift in the way literacy was taught in the state?
I think it started by looking at our outcomes for students. So in South Carolina, we have had pretty strong legislation and emphasis on literacy outcomes for students for over a decade. And despite that focus and the implementation of that pretty good law, our outcomes for students really didn't shift. And so in South Carolina right now, it's a flip of a coin whether or not a student is reading at grade level. About 52% of our students are not meeting standard in ELA in grades 3 through 8. And so that really prompted the question of why. And we started looking at how we were teaching reading and found that perhaps that was flawed, and we couldn't double down and do the same thing that we had always done and expect different outcomes. And that really led us to looking at the science of reading and thinking really deeply and intently about how we taught children how to read.
I mean, I think you said it well. I always say every organization or every state is perfectly designed to get the results that they're currently getting. If you want different results, you got to do things differently, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, to add on to that, it's also really important for us to recognize that the children aren't broken, the systems are. And so if we know and believe, like we do in South Carolina, that all children are capable of learning to read, if they are provided the resources and the instruction to do so, and we are seeing results where that is not the case, we have to think about what can we change as the adults in the system to improve outcomes for students.
Yeah, I think you also know that, just changing the curriculum isn't going to solve the problem. Like, people have to actually adopt the curriculum and teach it and understand it to teach it. So can you talk a little bit around just the thought process of all the components and the systems that are necessary from a state level perspective to support districts that are trying to push this all the way down to the classroom and ultimately to a student that needs to learn how to read?
Absolutely. So I think there are several different prongs of that. The first is teacher professional development and knowledge. And so that is why in South Carolina, we started with a cohort of schools about 3 years ago, 222 schools, which were our Palmetto Literacy Project schools. And they were identified as having the poorest reading outcomes in the state in third grade. And so we focused there, and we implemented a science of reading professional development for teachers. We are starting to see the benefits of that because we are now 3 years out, and we are seeing that student outcomes in those schools have actually improved. But when we started down that road, we saw teachers gaining the knowledge of how they needed to teach reading. But many of those teachers then said, well, the resources that we have in our classrooms are not aligned with these new practices that you're having us learn about. And so that brings the instructional materials part of that conversation. We have to make sure that once teachers have that knowledge, they also have instructional materials that are aligned with best practice. And then that has also made us start thinking about, are our standards and the requirements that we are giving to teachers, are they aligned to the science of reading and those foundational skills? So in South Carolina, we're at this really interesting place where there is a window of opportunity where we've rolled out training for teachers in science of reading to 5,000 teachers over the last 2 or 3 years. We recently got legislative funding to roll that out to K-3 teachers statewide. We recently revised our ELA standards and really focused on foundational literacy skills in K-3 and called those out explicitly. And then we're also going through a K-12 ELA instructional materials adoption. And so we are, for the very first time, being able to align all of those supports for teachers and focus them on whether or not students are receiving instruction around the science of reading and being taught to actually read on grade level. So I think that those 3 prongs, teacher professional development, instructional materials, and also standards aligned standards. And the next piece, I think, is once we have those standards implemented, are the assessments measuring the standards around reading as well. And then the last piece, which kind of helps us get upstream, I hope, is that South Carolina just it's costing us $39 million to retool our K-3 teachers across the state. And we know that schools of education across the state are graduating, thankfully, teachers every day. And those students are not being equipped with the skills that they need to teach students how to read. And so we've also been engaged in the conversation of how do we shift practice in our educator prep program so that we are not having to retrain, retool teachers once they get into the classroom. So I think that's the 5th leg that we've really got to focus on as a state as well if we're ever going to get upstream of this problem.
Yeah. So I want to double click on that a little bit because I was talking to a guy that has this well-known pizza shop, right? And I was like, what's the secret of your pizza? And he's like, because I was like, all the ingredients are the same between pizza place to pizza place, right? There's the dough, there's the sauce, there's the cheese and toppings. And so you kind of named that, right? Like PD, resources, assessment, standards, teacher education. But like, to me, those are like the ingredients, but every state kind of thinks about those ingredients, but the taste of the ingredients and how you put it together really matters to like get the exceptional pizza, right? And so if you had to kind of extrapolate that and say, all right, well, like, here's how we think about making our pizza with those ingredients, like, how would you describe that?
So in South Carolina, we have what's called the profile of a South Carolina graduate. And so it lists the skills that we think students should have when they graduate high school. And as a result of that, it's really started to make us think about what's the profile of the South Carolina teacher, what's the profile of the South Carolina administrator, and how all of those are aligned. And so we're not complete in that work, but I think, Anthony, that will help us really get to what are the skills that teachers need on day one to be successful. What's the flavor of the education profession in South Carolina, and how are we aligning the educator prep programs to make sure that they are equipping folks who say they want to be teachers with those skills? How are we making sure that our alt-route programs are equipping folks who are entering education not through the traditional route, but making sure that those folks are ready to teach on day one. Because what I say to people all the time is that our kids only have one shot at third grade. And so we can't expect that those new to the profession do not have the skills to teach on day one. So what does that look like? We're still developing that. I have strong ideas about what I think, but that's a much more collaborative conversation that will be happening in South Carolina and provide us that North Star that we can align around.
Great. And so, I've been working on 3 principles around implementing well. And after working with so many districts around the country, there's like 3 things that keep on coming back for me. The first is mindset. And, just making sure that the people that are having to implement something new are in the right mindset and understand the kind of the mental model around this. I think that's a really important condition for people to want to do something that's different or hard. The second is around this idea of collaborative learning, because I think as states think about a new thing like science reading, there's a moment where people who are making those decisions learn about it, but it doesn't like really flow through to everybody, right? Like oftentimes it gets pushed down to everybody. And so they don't have that kind of inspirational or aha moment through the research where they're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And they want to go off and do it. And then the third area is really around the systems, which I think you've been putting a lot of thought around, what are the long-term systems that need to exist? And so I'd like to touch upon each of those, and maybe just first starting with mindset. What have you learned that allows you to create kind of or get you closer to the right mindset for everybody to start thinking about this change?
I think it's being very honest and open about when we know better, we do better. And so I am very clear and try to say every time I am around a group of educators that I am very well educated in misinformed practices in reading. And so my master's in literacy was valuable, but I was very well trained in what I now know not to be best practice. And I think there are so many educators in South Carolina who went through that same education program or programs, and they're like, I went to school, I got a master's in this. This is what my professors, this is what my experience has told me was best practice. Now you're telling me something a little differently. And I think just being honest that, when we know better, we do better. As educators, we need to be lifelong learners. And as the science shifts, as we learn new things, that we have to be open to shifting our practice. I think in South Carolina, we have also benefited from starting in those 222 schools. And as those teachers have finished the professional development or moved through that professional development, there was initial resistance. And then after they got into the learning, they were able to say, why didn't I know this? And I'm able to apply this in my classroom, and I see benefits for students. And so what we've also tried to do is elevate the voices and experiences of those teachers who were kind of the tip of the spear in our work in South Carolina, and say, here are their stories. Listen to real classroom teachers who have gone through this learning journey and listen to what their experience has been like. And I think with educators, it's one thing for me at the state level to say it, but when their friend across town has, last year started this journey and they can hear from them how beneficial it has been, they're much more open to it. And I think once they start seeing the impact on students, they're much more likely to be open to it. And I think too, it's just, when we know better, we do better, but also we can't do what we've always done and expect different outcomes. And the outcomes in South Carolina are that more than half of our students are currently not on grade level. And so if you believe, like I do, that the children are not broken, but they also cannot read on grade level, what has to change for students to reach their full God-given potential? And so just having those conversations, I think, is really key to the mindset shift that has to happen.
Before we go on to the next point, principle there, I did want to just ask you about that kind of self-reflection, because I think I run into a lot of administrators and teachers who have, a lot of degrees, and it's uncomfortable for them to say, like, what I know at this elevated, with this elevated education is not correct anymore from the new information. How would you recommend others to think about that shift, just kind of like some simple lesson that you might have learned through your experience? Because I think that's a really important step for people to take.
I try to be student-centered, but data-driven or data-informed. And when I look at the data, the two things just can't be true together, that what we are doing is best practice and half of our kids are not learning to read. And so if I believe that all children can learn to read and that the children aren't broken, and I also know the data to be true that that is currently not our reality, what has to shift? And to me, I'll always kind of fall on the kids aren't broken. So it has to be the systems that need to shift, to your point, to get different outcomes. And so when I think you really sit back and think about that and recognize that, we're always learning. We should be lifelong learners. And it's not weak to admit that you were wrong and that we should be doing things differently. It puts people in a vulnerable space, but I think we have to lead through example as leaders in the district, at the state level, in schools, to say, y'all, I did tell you that you should be doing this for the last 10 years, and it just has not worked for the majority of our kids. So we've got to shift.
That's kind of a great segue into the next question, which is, clearly you have a lot of knowledge and you put a lot of thought into the science of reading and, how to implement this. And, there's districts that are buying into this as well. But from what you've seen, what are some tips that you would give to a new district leader who's thinking about implementing this? They know they have to implement it in a year, but there's some experiences of learning that are missing when you're just given a plan to implement. And so I really think that you had and others had some time to learn and absorb and process and, reflect on these things. And oftentimes we don't get that same opportunity to everybody else. And so what do you recommend districts think about as they try to roll that out and create those kinds of experiences for their teachers?
I think you have to start small. I think setting up a place where there are teachers who are successful and they can spread that message, I think that's important. I think you have to scale and spread quickly, but having that initial cohort that other educators can look to is important. I think that creating professional learning communities where teachers are going through this journey together and have the opportunity to reflect and think through how the implementation in their classroom is going is also important. It's really comfortable when we teach like we've always taught, and it's hard to shift that. And so we also, in addition to having that time to reflect, we have to have coaches and administrators who know what to look for and are encouraging those teachers who are trying it for the first time and recognizing that, it may look a lot easier and more natural, the old way of teaching reading, because that's how those teachers had taught for 15 years, that there are going to be learning pains when you shift. I think also really going deep into the research and the reading about what the science of reading is and what the science of reading is not is also important, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about science of reading. And I think it's important to be clear about what it is and what it is not. I think it's important to have aligned instructional materials that do support that new learning, because it's not fair to the teacher to expect them to be learning this new way of thinking about reading instruction and then only providing them instructional materials that support misinformed practices. And then I think it's also thinking about that alignment of all of our resources, including our core and also our supplemental resources. As administrators, we really got to think through how to bring that alignment.
I'm curious about that one zone though, because I think a lot of districts think about like a small cohort that, the early adopters, right? And then they hope that kind of the majority kind of follow through. And so there's a huge chasm between like the early adopters, that's why it's called the chasm, right? So from your experience, like how can administrators help bridge that chasm? Like, what can they do? So, and also, like, what's the right amount of time where people can be operating in cohort mode before you actually scale this? Because I think that's also like not really baked in everyone's implementation plans.
I agree. And I've been lucky in South Carolina that we started with a relatively small cohort of 5,000 teachers 2 years ago. And so those teachers are completing, and it was 227 schools. We have 1,200 schools across the state. And so it wasn't, a tiny cohort of schools. It was a significant number, but we've been able to learn from that and scale up. We are planning to train 25,000 more teachers over the next few years. We're starting with the Coalition of the Willing. And so what we offer to districts is that we have the funds to pay for and support the implementation of professional development around the science of reading. Who wants to be a part of that? And we allow districts to go full scale and do all of their schools, or to choose individual schools within their district. Almost all of our districts chose at least one school to start with. And then in the spring of next year, we're going to add to that Coalition of the Willing 5,000 more teachers. Eventually, Anthony, we're going to get to the Coalition of the Told instead of the Coalition of the Willing. And I think that is going to bring unique implementation challenges. But I think once we get there and we get momentum from our cohort and the Coalition of the Willing, and we can point to improved outcomes for students and systems that have been able to support implementation, that hopefully there will not be as much resistance. But I think you've got to keep going back to the data. Like if your data is not supporting students being able to read, students not being able to reach grade level, something in that system is off. What are you doing to address that? With our Coalition of the Willing, we've been able to see improvements for kids. So why not try it? What you're doing is not working.
Yeah. So the last question around resilient systems, I'm going to tweak it a little bit, because based off of what you said, I feel like perhaps you might have a view on if you had to like implement from scratch again at a state, how would you like envision a 3-year roadmap for implementation of something this scale? I'd love to just hear you kind of brainstorm and outline an idea of how you would do it again if you had to.
Yeah, well, and I think if I were blue skying, I would think through how ELA standards and our standards aligned with the science of reading, and do they explicitly call out the foundational literacy skills that are necessary? I think that that's an important first step. I think that professional development for teachers is an important second step, that we've got to retrain and support teacher knowledge. And then once teachers begin to gain that new knowledge, we also need to think about what do the instructional materials that the state, the district provides, are they aligned with that new learning and with those new standards? And I also think about what information do the state, the district's assessment systems provide around students' learning and reading outcomes. And I think it's really important that there are alignment between all of those pieces. And then the administrative support from coaches and administrators in the district office, because it's really been interesting to me in our implementation that where the most of our holdouts are not with teachers, not even usually with school-based literacy coaches. It's with the district office kind of literacy coordinators group, curriculum folks. And I think, Anthony, to one of the points you made earlier, is that those folks have been successful and well-trained in misguided practices. And so they are And they're also not likely today to be working one-on-one with students. And so they are not seeing the impact of this new learning on student outcomes. And so they're the group that has been really interesting. And I've been thinking about how do we do a better job of engaging with those folks around the implementation, because we really don't have a lot of teachers who are not excited about the learning, particularly after they get into it. And I think this is important to think about too when you're thinking about implementation, this should not be something additional outside of the day. It needs to be built into the instructional day. The time needs to be provided so it's not one more thing that teachers need to do. It needs to be structured in a way that teachers have the time and the space to engage with the work. But if you build systems like that, I think the teachers, in our experience, have been very positive about the learning. It's kind of the district office staff that is sometimes more resistant.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. I think that's just to think about it's the person that has a lot of knowledge, like a lot of expertise, but not the day-to-day experience in executing that, right?
And it's well-meaning. Like I also want to stress the point that these folks are very well-meaning people who are thinking they are doing what's best for children as well. And how do you open up a forum in which you're having those conversations about how do we move the ball forward for students? And I think when you create those forums to have those conversations, reasonable people will be reasonable.
Fascinating. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for making the time to share your experience and knowledge. I think, there's so many states that are looking to implement this and at different stages. I think, South Carolina has been at the forefront in thinking through a lot of this stuff and planning it out with methodologies and the supports and the systems thinking that you guys are bringing. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I look forward to listening to all of your other guests and learn from them as well, because this is not easy work, but it's important work. And I really think in education, if we are not addressing literacy and really illiteracy, then we're wasting time. That should be on the front of our mind every day.
Great closing. Thank you so much, Matthew.